started. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you the keynote panelists. And we'll just go in the order in which it's listed in the program, starting with Zaynab Bernoussi.
Thank you so much, Monica, for the honor of this invitation. Thank you for setting up my slides. So I hope, I could do without them, but I just thought, I got pressure from Monica, so I wanted to have slides as well. I also wanted to give a little shout out to Anjou Paul from New York University Abu Dhabi, because thanks to her, I got to know about this call, and she's also a fantastic sociologist. I come from political science, so it's also quite, for me, an honor to be welcome here, and I'll be talking about the importance of interdisciplinarity. So that's part of the things I wanted to touch upon. And here, to do that, I have 2 points. So the first one is on the importance of looking beyond one's disciplinary silos. Sociology among the social science studies does that the most. So I think, it's more sort of natural, but for someone coming from international relations theories, it's really something that we should strive for more. And the second point is the need to look at the global south. I think it's obvious in talking about solving global poverty, but the need to do it in a more holistic way, in the sense of trying to engage more with that integration of the global south, not only as a subject of research, but also as a site for knowledge production. My goal here is to maybe invite us to see the importance of problem setting in problem solving. So I understand that we have the title of this conference, problem solving. It's very aspirational. But it's also, sometimes it comes at a cost, right? And I think we've talked about maybe the problems with some of the research in economics. And I think part of that is also to remember that the problem setting is extremely important. And that's also part of that maybe problem solving path. Okay, so in here, I put political study, and I just wanted to maybe highlight for me why the two disciplines are so complementary, political study and political sociology, and looking particularly at my work. So very broadly, what we're looking at with political study is really the for whom, right? So trying to paint the bigger picture. And in here, for instance, if we look at particular experiences, so I'm here referring to some of my work on protesters, right? So we have very personal experiences, right? This is something we deal with obviously in sociology, but it's also so insightful on a political structure, right? And even bigger than that, on a wider context of international politics. And here, I would like to use the words of feminist scholar Cynthia and Lowy on the personal being, the international. So that need of painting the bigger picture, and to echo what Lina said earlier, to also look at the power structure, right, as we're dealing with our problems in our communities. For me, the political sociology, the sociology approach attempts to answer the how, right? So that's very key. And again, referring to my work on protesters in the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, right? So we had those moments of expressing grievance, right? Speaking back to authority, and you can look at it in its finer grain, right? So what it's meant for every maybe social class that was out there in the streets, but it also was very meaningful in terms of telling us something about agency of actors as they are instrumentalizing a moment, right? So a moment of regional dynamics, right? So the so-called Arab Spring, but a global one of speaking back or of protesting precarity, increasing inequalities. So more on here, where I'm coming from. And as I mentioned, I looked at international relations theory from a post-colonial perspective. And there, I also just wanted to, okay, move this slide, sorry. So, so I wanted just to point to an example of seeing, for instance, in the current act of speaking back to authority, right? So the grievances of protesters in post-colonial context, and I looked at the example of the 1956 nationalization of the Suez Canal in Egypt as a moment of demanding dignity as a collective versus 2011, when it was the moment of demanding dignity in a very individualized sense, right? As my rights as someone from the LGBTQ plus community, as someone that doesn't have a job, right? As opposed to that expression as a national demand. So those are some of those interesting here differences we can look at. So another thing to also maybe reflect on when thinking about that moment, 2011, the recurrence of grieving groups in the post-colonial context, is how that's also painted. It's painted a global momentum, so of rising inequalities. So when we had 2011 in the Arab region, right, we had the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy everything around the world, the Indignados in Spain, later on the Gilets jaunes in France, right? And it was interesting, right, to see how these protest movements echoed each other, right? Despite coming from different contexts, but again, there was here a global context that's probably made those or can explain those connections. So, for instance, there some of the literature was talking about, well, maybe this is because of the political regimes there, right? There was a outrage against the authoritarian nature of these political regimes, right? But again, here, very interesting work from sociologists, Asif Bayat, as an example, contending this idea, saying that, well, maybe you don't have democracy, right, in the Western sense, right? But you have something that is more context-based, right? You still have a dynamic of politics from below, right? That is operating, and that means that there is in that sense, a form of bargaining with power. So that meant, right, that saying, well, the Arab Spring was because people were fed up with authoritarian regimes was not satisfactory enough, right? So one other thing I wanted to here talk about is a next group project that I actually just submitted with my authors, and that reflects a bit of my journey thinking about here the need to look at maybe answers for our to dig and examine our topics of research beyond our disciplines, beyond our disciplinary silos. So as I mentioned, first looking and borrowing from political sociology to look at the problems of political integration in the Arab region, right? Looking at the case of the Arab uprisings 2011. So right there, looking at the interconnection, sociology, politics, but then also realizing that there is also a very deep connection with the economy. And looking particularly at the international political economy. So in this next project, we argue with my co-authors that to help solve problems of economic, among other things, economic growth, we need to also look at the rules of the game, right? Meaning here global order. And that means that, for instance, if we look at the problem of poverty, right, it needs to be contextualized in time and in space. So, for instance, food insecurity in the African continent is not just because of scarcity of resources, but it's also because of two things. So first, you have the neoliberal diet, right, in which we have a promotion of consuming wheat, meat, sugar, right? This means that we're eating less of our local foods, our indigenous modes of eating. Second, in here we have also a regime that caters to the food security of other foreign countries, right, at the expense of one's food security. So meaning that we are using land, right, for instead of local food production for cash crops that go to export. So as we talked about regarding the developmental state. And in dealing with these types of questions, what we are trying to do is also be part of that decoloniality and decolonizing of knowledge production. I think doing that contextualization does that in the sense that we are trying to look at how, for instance, these modes of knowing things are not just they're out of the blue, right? So they are part of, in a Marxian language, a historical materialism, right? And so, for instance, to fix, right, this problem of maybe disparity or disproportion in knowledge production, it's not just about infusing diversity, but actually looking at how these modes of production create, right, this process. So a sort of more holistic approach. And okay, so one last thing, I just wanted quickly to refer to a work of a political economist. I think the work of also political economists is very, very helpful. Ali Kadri. On the difference in the development trajectories of the Middle East versus the Arab world. So as I said, I'm going to talk about the global south. I'm going to talk a bit also about the Middle East. So what he is revealing that I think is quite convincing is how to explain, right, that differential. So you have the East Asian miracles, right, of development versus the not so successful development of the Middle East. And part of it for him is also due to how these two regions, right, connect to the US imperialist projects, right? So one in East Asia that contains China versus one in the Middle East, where there is a stirring of conflict that promotes militarization, that then promotes also the lowering of the cost of energy, right? And these things are very important to connect. So my last message is keep an eye on the Middle East. I talked about the changing global order. This is where it's operating. I think there is also there a battle of a moral order with the devastating violence. And thank you.
Next, we have Patrick Keller of Brown University.
Oh, it's a real pleasure and a real honor to be here. I love these development conferences. They're fantastic. It's great to see so many familiar faces. And I want to begin by thanking Monica, Nina, and Beverly for this morning's session, because you basically did everything I was hoping to do and then some. So I'm not going to take up the big theoretical themes you took up. Instead, I'm going to do a little pedestrian stock taking of what we know about poverty reduction, given the literature of, say, the last 30 years. But I do want to begin by, I agree with everything you said, but I especially agreed with the points about the dilemmas of emancipatory sociology. We're all here as sociologists because of the emancipatory tradition, right? And that often drives us in these sort of deep critiques. You know, Marx famously had an essay called For Ruthless Criticism of Everything and Anything Under the Sun, right? And we sort of all share that critical spirit, but sometimes it can be a bit of a rabbit hole. And I do think it's important to pull ourselves back. And as Monica has argued in this really nice piece she has engaging with the literature on emancipatory sociology, but pull it back a little bit to the more pragmatist tradition and do what I would call the work of identifying the parameters of the possible. And this is something that I think is actually quite concrete. And I want to illustrate it by referencing the work of the Brazilian sociologist Eduardo Marques. He's at USP, the University of Sao Paulo. And Eduardo and his grad students and his colleagues for the last 20, 30 years have been doing this very minute work of looking at the policies of urban governance in Sao Paulo, which is not only the largest city in the Americas, but arguably one of the most unequal. And some of it bores down so deep that it can actually get quite boring, right? It's into the technicalities of policy processes, et cetera, what they call, the Brazilians always come up with new language, and they call these policy instruments. And many of these instruments come from civil society actors, but then transition into the state and get institutionalized. And over time, Eduardo and his colleagues, and Ben Bradlow has a book just out called Urban Power, comparing Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, making very similar arguments. They show that all things considered, Sao Paulo's made a lot of progress in terms of making the city more inclusive. And he coins the term incremental progressivism. I love that term. And so I want to give you a sense of how I think the literature has in various ways documented some of that incremental progressivism over the last 3 decades. So we know that growth can be good for reducing poverty. I recognize that. Maybe the economists have been a little too obsessed with growth, but all things being equal, increasing productivity, especially growth as a broader process, but if you could actually generate growth through increased productivity, that's generally a good thing. The problem is all other things being equal, and they're not equal. Right? So growth in the context of inherited, accumulated historical inequalities, especially in post-colonial context, often produces more inequality, et cetera. So instead, sociologists look to redistribution. And redistribution is complicated. Like, when I was a grad student, it was assumed that growth and redistribution were a zero-sum game. You either got one or the other. And I want to highlight 6 lessons of the last 2 or 3 decades that suggest it's not a zero-sum game, and that as hard as it is, redistribution is possible. First lesson, and this is an old lesson, but I think it has to be repeated. You can do more with less. some of the most successful cases of sustained social development in the global south are places that started off with very little. And I'm thinking of Kerala and Tamil Nadu in India. I'm thinking of Costa Rica, Mauritius. These are places that in the 80s, 90s were not very developed economically, had limited resources, and yet made labor-intensive investments in education, primary healthcare. And the payoffs have been enormous, which leads to lesson number 2, and Monica referenced this literature this morning. We now know that early investment in social indicators and social development can lead to economic growth, right? And the prima facie case for that, of course, is East Asia, which also started with very little wealth to distribute, and yet made these investments, and now, of course, economically been great success stories in the last 20, 30 years. A third lesson is universalism and rights-based policies and services work better than means-tested and targeted policies. That's not always true, but it's especially true in the political sense is that it builds broad political support for continuing those policies. A fourth lesson is the global south has been incredibly innovative. Now, we always talk about development bank and the unilateral, sure, but the global south itself has been incredibly innovative in developing new instruments. An obvious one, I think, and the evidence here now is quite substantial, conditional cash transfer programs. And there's many different kinds. NREGA in India, which is actually an employment scheme, largest anti-poverty program in history. Bolsa Família in Brazil, Progressa. Pakistan has a program, the social grants program in South Africa. These have had huge positive impacts on reducing poverty. A fifth lesson is that policies that specifically benefit and target women have huge multiplier effects. The story of Bangladesh, we want to realize Bangladesh has done better than India and the rest of South Asia in the last 20 years in terms of improving social development indicators. And a lot of that is through programs that have specifically benefited women. A sixth lesson, and this is sort of the macro lesson, and that comes out of the comparative literature, is that democracy is very good for redistribution. Democratic regimes in the global south have done better at pursuing redistributed poverty-reducing strategies than autocratic regimes. And within the set of democratic countries, the ones that are more participatory have done a lot better. So the Southern Cone in Latin America has done relatively well. It's more democratic. But Brazil, especially given where it came from, has done especially well when one compares it to the rest of the Southern Cone. All of which then leads us to new theories of what I call the social democratic developmental state, right? And we already know what it looks like. It looks a lot like the developmental state, with the big difference that it's actually embedded in civil society, right? Which is the privileged domain of research for sociology. Right? So there's a real opportunity here to further deepen our understanding of these kind of states. So having said that, where do we stand now? So the bad news is the mobility of capital. You know, Gramsci famously said, you can organize all sorts of compromises under capitalism, but you can't touch the essential, which is private property. Private property is more secure, more sacred, more enforced and guaranteed and governed, and inimical to allowing for genuine redistribution than it's ever been before. And the evidence here is really clear. Beverly mentioned land reforms. Land reforms were hugely important to East Asia. They were hugely important to Kerala and India, which has been, you know, the great success story of development. Land reforms today are off the policy agenda. They're impossible, given the mobility of capital markets, et cetera. That's a huge problem. And then, of course, historically, when we talk about the expansion of the welfare state, we think about organized, militant, encompassing working classes. Well, we're in a post-industrial economy since 2001. The working classes are more disorganized than they've ever been. Informal sectors are still massive and huge and an incredible drag on the possibility of developing an inclusive economy. So that's the bad news. The good news, and sometimes we lose sight of this, but in the last 30 years, there's actually been a huge expansion of the welfare state in the global south. So I think the evidence from Latin America on this is really clear by any indicator. Especially again in the Southern Cone, the Latin American welfare state has expanded, and whether you measure it as HDI or the Standard Social Development Indicators, huge improvement. India, under the United Progressive Alliance, this is 2004-2014, India built the largest welfare state in the world, 1.4 billion people, but they rolled out massive rights-based programs, mostly in rural areas, but that's, of course, where most of poverty in the world is concentrated. And that's been a huge success. And they're being reversed now under Modi, but still, we have to acknowledge it. South Africa, by some estimates, is the most redistributive middle-income country in the world through the social grants program. Now, they haven't done as well in other sectors, but at least in social grants, they have rolled those out successfully. So there's been quite a bit of advancement in terms of the capacities of these social developmental states. But that leaves us a whole set of, I think, really important research questions. I want to finish by just identifying some important research challenges. One is there are a lot of puzzles here that remain unresolved. We have a massive literature on European, we know all sorts of stuff about European welfare states, tons of data, et cetera. We still know relatively little about welfare states in the global south. A lot of dissertation projects out there for those of you who are looking. We need to do a better job of explaining variation. If you compare, I have a colleague at Brown who's coming out with a new book comparing Brazil and Argentina. They started in the same place, post-authoritarian regime. Brazil's actually done a lot better than Argentina. Why? It's not obvious, right? Politics, this, that, but these are significant variations. The big puzzle in India is the North versus the South. I mean, the state of Kerala has social development indicators that are beginning to look like Europe, right? Whereas Bihar and UP in the North haven't made nearly as much progress. And it's not just Kerala, it's also Tamil Nadu and Himachal Pradesh, actually in the North. So it's not just North-South, but in tremendous subnational variation. Why? Explaining policy possibilities. So Eduardo Marquez and his research team in Sao Paulo, they distinguish between what they call hard redistribution and soft redistribution. So public housing, and we rarely talk about this in the context of welfare policy, but most poverty in the world now going forward is urban poverty in slums, right? And the obvious policy solution is housing. Building public housing means basically expropriating land. You can't do that, or it's really, really hard to do. Hard redistribution. You can redevelop slums quite successfully. And Sao Paulo, again, is a model here. The favelas of Sao Paulo are much better off in terms of services, access, opportunity, education, et cetera, than they were a generation or two ago. We talked about nodal agencies, and it's true, the literature on the state, the developmental state was about these nodal agencies. But we neglected frontline workers. And it turns out when you do it right with frontline workers, public health workers, the social workers that go into slums and work with communities to do in situ redevelopment, you can get quite extraordinary results. And there's a lot of great new research that's been done on frontline workers. The subnational question. I mentioned the variation within India is greater than the variation across Europe. And yet, how many comparative subnational studies do we have of India? And likewise, across Brazilian cities, tremendous variation in the efforts to develop more inclusive forms of governance. The big question, seventh research question, what are the drivers? All the models we have don't really work. Power resource theory, that's a grad student, this is what I learned. When the working class is mobilized, organized as unions, and you have social democratic parties, you get a big welfare state. Well, yeah, where's the working class today? It's shrinking, it's not nearly as organized. The informal sector is often much bigger. Instead, what we're seeing are cases where proactive state officials are driving certain reforms, and other cases where a more complex configuration of civil society actors have managed somehow to make demands on the state and secure more social investments. But again, we need a lot more research on this. I want to finish with a big challenge. A few years ago, I wrote a piece, and this is the most pessimistic title I could come up with, called The Age of Reaction. And the point was, the backsliding in democracy today is almost as severe as between the two world wars, which gave us fascism. So we have the rise of ethno-nationalist regimes across the world, beginning right here. But of course, India with Modi and Hindufa, we had the episode of 4 years of Bolsonaro in Brazil, Duarte in the Philippines, et cetera. Again, we don't really have a set of, why is this happening so globally? And one of the things that's truly alarming about the phenomenon in the global south is that these regimes aren't just attacks on Muslims, as in the case of India, they're also attacks on the welfare state. These are expressions of what I call retrenchment populism. They're literally efforts by elites to roll back the social progress of the last 30 years. That said, and I do want to end on a positive note, a recent wave of elections, and hopefully one coming up right here, has pointed to some degree of democratic resilience. Bolsonaro is gone, the institutions held. You know, Modi was disciplined a little in the last election in India, and most interestingly was abandoned by Dalits in North India, which is a big break in his otherwise very broad coalition. In France, we had Le Front Républicain that, for now at least, seems to have defeated the rise of the nationalist right to power. So there's quite a bit of resiliency out there despite everything. But again, we need a better comparative understanding of all this. So to finish, we really need to think more about the political and the social forces, if you will, the constellations of organized power that can either promote or undermine democracy and welfare throughout the global south. Thank you.
Next, we have Jennifer Keahey of Arizona State.
Everybody, I want to send out a great thank you to all of you who organized the conference, including the conference organizers themselves, but also the Sociology of Development Council and the chairs of our past 2 years who put so much work into bringing back this conference. Thank you to you. So the title of my talk is Authoritarianism and the Spirit of Poverty. So basically that means I'm going to be picking up where Patrick Heller has left off. Through the final decades of the 20th century, several nations secured their independence from authoritarian regimes without succumbing to civil war. In northeastern Europe, 2 million people formed the Baltic Way in 1989, peacefully joining hands in a human chain that flowed through the capital cities of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This was but one protest in a broader singing revolution, and in 1991, the 3 Baltic states regained their independence after nearly 50 years of Soviet occupation. In Southern Africa, Namibians and South Africans were engaged in their own struggle for independence. Less than 2 weeks after the Baltic Way, thousands of activists took to the streets of Cape Town in an act of civil disobedience. This purple rain protest sparked a period of sustained action that forced South Africa to dismantle apartheid. In 1994, the former anti-apartheid revolutionary, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, was elected to lead the nation to multiracial democracy. In 2024, our social reality looks quite different. Left-wing populist movements that once engaged in revolutionary struggles for freedom and democracy have been replaced by right-wing populist movements that are seeking a return to authoritarian and ethno-nationalist rule. Consider, for example, the wave of protests that erupted this summer in England and Northern Ireland. From July 30th to August 7th, ordinary people participated in a wave of violence against immigrants. If this protest was the latest action in a movement fueled by reactionary interests, it was also driven by misinformation. The riots began after 3 young girls were stabbed to death at a Taylor Swift dance event. In the wake of these murders, authoritarian influencers took to social media, blaming the stabbings on an unidentified immigrant. Yet the actual perpetrator was an underage boy who was a British citizen. In this talk, I explore the rise of right-wing populism and identify what I term a spirit of poverty, or a zeitgeist of nihilism that has enabled authoritarian leaders to co-opt and capture protest movements in the early 21st century. I employ a multi-paradigmatic framework, both to explain the impoverished spirit that is driving reactionary protests and to challenge the divisions that are threatening democracy around the world. I then share actionable methods that I have used in my own research and teaching to spark critical conscientization and rekindle social connectivity in a world sundered by difference. Social inequality is continuing to rise within and between nations. 50 years of neoliberal globalization have erased many of the gains made by labor movements in the mid-20th century, fueling economic precarity amongst middle and working class people. In Capital in the 21st Century, the French economist Thomas Piketty finds that the gap between wealthy and poor now is similar to that of the mid-18th century in the years leading up to the French Revolution. This evidence suggests that economic precarity is a key factor in the resurgence of authoritarian attitudes and behaviors. In a study on the politics of retrenchment populism in India and Brazil, our own Patrick Heller shows how authoritarian party leaders have capitalized from the backlash against globalization by shifting the blame for economic precarity onto immigrants and other minoritized groups. My talk contributes to this body of knowledge by considering the question of social cohesion. I bring two scholars into dialogue in full awareness that their bodies of knowledge historically have stood in opposition, namely the classical functionalist Emile Durkheim and the anti-colonial Marxist Frantz Fanon. By sharing key concepts from these two very different scholars, I not only clarify why economically insecure people are voting for billionaires who are overtly backed by other billionaires, but I also show how sociology, as a multi-paradigmatic science, can play a role in challenging ideological divisions. Beginning with Durkheim, we may look beyond the mere material economy to consider the breakdown in social cohesion wrought by the digital revolution. Never before have people been so plugged in and tuned out. Our social interactions increasingly occur online through the post-factual realm of social media, whose platforms tend to reflect dominant norms and values, and which are mostly owned by very wealthy men who have a vested interest in reproducing society's most conservative views. Most people living around the world today cannot hope to obtain the material standards of living portrayed as the norm in social media, nor do most of us look like those narrow categories of people who are publicly admired rather than demonized. To deflect attention from their ties to global capital, authoritarian leaders have weaponized identity politics, using the playbook of mechanical solidarity to inflame culture wars on social media platforms. This is hindering political organizing across social and ideological borders. From a Durkheimian perspective, the toxic combination of mechanical solidarity and anomie are key features of the spirit of poverty that is threatening democratic functioning today. As an anti-colonial Marxist scholar, Frantz Fanon sheds complementary light on the spirit of poverty. For Fanon, liberation struggles are not simply an external fight for national sovereignty or for collective freedom from racist regimes. Rather, the struggle for liberation also is a psychological practice that involves decolonizing the spirit. In his 1959 book, Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon identified internalized oppression as a key weapon deployed by colonizing regimes, and as a symbolic force that causes people to self-perpetuate states of oppression. Fanon's focus was on the French colonial system in Martinique. However, 21st century authoritarianism engages a similar playbook. Employing social media as a primary means for disseminating a motley array of stereotypes that dehumanizes most people, authoritarian leaders get people to vote against their own interests by inculcating feelings of self-hatred and anomie. Whereas French colonial bureaucrats weaponized education to teach colonial subjects about their inferiority, retrenchment populism has weaponized identity politics to fragment people from one another, thereby reproducing a state of psychological oppression that robs people of their agency. Thus, it is clear to me that liberation movements cannot succeed by deploying the playbook of mechanical solidarity that makes enemies of some categories of people in order to save other categories of people. If sociology is to play a meaningful role in addressing this zeitgeist of spiritual poverty, it is by leaning into our multi-paradigmatic roots with the goal of reconciling divisions. If sociology is to play a meaningful role in addressing feelings of internalized oppression that prevent people from realizing self-determination, then let us direct our methods toward the service of building organic solidarity across lines of social and ideological difference. Participatory action research, known as PAR, is a methodology for building critical consciousness through collective research and practice. As such, it is suitable for awakening impoverished spirits. In a critical study titled Power, Knowledge, and Emancipation, the Colombian sociologist Orlando Paz Borda contributed to the advancement of PAR by detailing 4 rules for practice. His first order of engagement involves establishing wholly collaborative partnerships that eliminate the subject-object, researcher-researched dichotomy. The second directive involves centering counter-narratives that challenge elitist interpretations of historic events and scientific methods. The third prioritizes supporting the efforts of marginalized communities to recover and develop their own knowledges, values, and agency. Finally, Falls Borda tasks sociology with demystifying its science through knowledge sharing, both in community-based research arenas and through popular culture. As a global South methodology with roots in the anti-colonial discourses and movements of the latter half of the 20th century, PAR offers concrete methods for building critical consciousness. Given its direct focus on power, it is challenging to conduct, and it requires a rigorous commitment to critical self-reflection and reflexive engagement. These are tall orders for scholars to fulfill, particularly for those of us who are situated in academic spaces that reward speed and detachment. Despite these challenges, I've found PAR to be a deeply rewarding methodology, as it has forced me to continuously open my mind to difference, making me more capable of meeting people where they are. Over the course of my career, I have mentored several PhD students in this and other ASA sections who have told me that they have been advised by their mentors not to employ PAR in their doctoral research if they wish to have a career in academia. While I understand that this advice is well-meaning, in reality, the topics and approaches that interest hiring committees are in constant flux. And as most PAR scholars also employ qualitative and even quantitative methods in their research, there are many different ways to package your skills. Thus, I offer a different set of advice, asking the students who come to me, do you want to get a job by looking like everyone else, or do you want to get a job by standing out from the crowd? Sociology is a multi-paradigmatic science, and as sociologists, each of us have a choice. One may choose to do a study that will inform how a select group of scholars think about a problem, or one may decide to conduct research that helps communities obtain the capacity needed to solve problems. There is a well-developed body of knowledge on action research, and the fact that I stand before you today means that it is possible to do PAR and still get a job in academia. In terms of teaching, I instituted pedagogical changes in my courses in response to the pandemic, and I continue to deepen these changes in response to the poverty of spirit that I'm seeing in my students. Prior to the pandemic, I taught environmental sociology as a service learning course, employing action-oriented pedagogy to offset the bleak course content. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, I could no longer send students to volunteer with organizations. Thus, I replaced the service learning experience with an autoethnographic research project. I made the project as simple as possible. I introduced the following 3 readings to class. First, Harriet Martineau's classical treatise on sociological research methods, namely excerpts from her 1838 book, How to Observe Morals and Manners. Second, C. Wright Mill's chapter, The Promise, from his 1959 book, The Sociological Imagination. And third, the article Living Autoethnography, Connecting Life and Research, published by Faith Wambura, Ngakiri, and colleagues in Journal of Research Practice. I tasked my students to spend the semester going outside and observing the world around them. They submitted weekly observations of their experience, which I graded via pass-fail system, enabling them to reflect freely without fear of my authoritarian judgment. And later in the semester, the students determined key findings and wrote a final paper. What I learned from this experience astonished me. While I grew up like many kids of my generation playing outside, I discovered that many of my students had no experiential knowledge of their environment prior to this project. Simply put, most had grown up indoors and online. Whether my students hiked along trails or walked their urban environment for this project, the experience of observing the world around them had awakened a profound hunger for connection. The first year that I ran this project, one of my students simply decided to go outside and take a walk in her neighborhood each week. When she stood in front of the classroom to present her project, she burst into tears, telling the class that she had never taken a walk outside by herself before. Suffering from extreme anxiety, she spent most of her life alone in her room. These walks made her aware of all the other species sharing her neighborhood. She became a friend to birds, whom she felt were like her, nesting in a blighted concrete landscape. And it was their freedom of flight that encouraged her to keep walking outside. She concluded her presentation by telling the class that the project made her realize that she was a member of a society where humans are socialized to go from house to car and from work to home, too absorbed in their thoughts to hear the bird song. At the end of the semester, she wrote a thought-provoking paper that examined the impact of urban environments on human health and argued the importance of human-nature connection for social well-being. If the current spirit of poverty is, as I've argued here, anomie inculcated by internalized oppression, then liberation may be realized through the cultivation of organic solidarity and in direct response to all that appears to divide us. In recognizing its fundamental connection to difference, the spirit of sovereignty cannot be so easily manipulated by discourses of fear. The sovereign spirit is capable of self-determination, not because it has power over others, nor because it has been freed from material deprivation, but rather because it realizes that the power that exists with and within to solve the problems that we all face. Thank you.
And next we have Michael Woolcock of the World Bank and Harvard University.
Good afternoon, everyone, and let me join my colleagues on the panel in thanking everybody who's been associated with organizing these gatherings. The ones I've been to have always been very rewarding and enjoyable, and that's no less true of this one. So, especially here in Washington, the epicenter for much of the big and sometimes the small work that is done in development. I'm going to speak across 5 different domains. To start off with some just basic sort of analytical categories and distinctions just to set us the stage. Move from that into some basic sort of strategy principles that I think emerge, for me at least, out of the kind of work that I do. I'm then going to argue that sociologists need to basically double down on their theory and methods and being useful in the world, but that there's a step involved in doing that kind of work that I think none of us are really trained in. I certainly wasn't. But in the 27th year that I am now, I've been at the World Bank working in the research department in a very publish or perish kind of culture. Nonetheless, I have survived that long because I haven't tried to be a bad economist. I've tried to do the best I can on the basis of the training I had, but seeing it as a complement to and not a substitute for the ways in which other people of goodwill and a lot of commitment and intelligence are trying to do to engage with their particular problems. And then I'll finish on just some basic sort of applications of this that I think we should heed if we're going to be doing this work of putting sociology itself to work in the field of international and economic development. I think you can sort of enter the development space through 2 different prisms, as it were. One, the more classical approach, really, or at least in terms of social science theory, born out of the post-World War II experience, was national development in the post-colonial period. Countries that were now notionally at least freed of their colonial overlords had a vision for their country that was a wholesale transformation of that society into a prosperous and bigger and better version of itself. And that's sort of really where much of the original big theory and smaller theories around development emerged. In the most recent decades of the 21st century, though, the emphasis, and I think partly as a result of the end of the Cold War and partly because of the skittishness that seems to perennially surround development, there's been an ever stronger focus on just looking at how we can get individuals or specific targeted groups from underneath something called a poverty line to being a little bit above the poverty line and celebrating that as a great big accomplishment, which it may well be. But I don't think that was the original vision for development. It's just getting people from one side of an entirely arbitrary poverty line to another and claiming, therefore, that poverty has gone down. The bigger vision and the reason that rich countries became rich and poorer countries became rich is not because they had a whole bunch of targeted little interventions to try and get people from one side of a poverty line to another. It's because they built out a whole different administrative and social apparatus for engaging everybody to try and move them and the whole ways in which their society was structured into a very different place. And we also knew, I think, as part of that process, that was just damn hard to do it, but just playing with fire at every single step. You were constantly involved in some form of Schumpeterian creative destruction, that the very essence of trying to transform something, meaning you were in some cases completely undermining, compromising, or eroding tens of thousands of years in some cases of particular groups, otherwise well-established ways of doing things. And we called that progress. We called that improvement. We now measure that through things like the Sustainable Development Goals, and that provides the ends that justifies all sorts of means. And I think part of what we're trying to do, what we should be trying to do much more in development, and what social theory would be is an excellent guide to helping us with, is helping us navigate and negotiate our ways around this inherent relentless revolution that we're putting in motion all the time, as Joyce Appleby calls it. So we have these sort of two different ways of thinking and acting in the world. And I want to stress, I guess, that different people have different foci for what they want to do, what particular approach to things most animates them and what they really care about. A lot of people generally do very carefully and seriously care about the welfare of particular groups. Maybe they're a member of that group themselves, or just had a very close visceral experience with that and want to see their purpose of living as being to focus on enhancing the welfare of that particular group. But I think for those of us that work in big international agencies or that are thinking about development as it's mostly been framed here in this kind of conference, we're really much having, I think, a much equally complementary approach to thinking about what this societal transformational process looks like and how we can do that in the somewhat vainglorious sort of belief that human reason and resourcing can actually change all of those things in a sensible way. But when it isn't so reasonable, and it isn't done so well, nonetheless having some plan Bs, Cs, and Ds that might help us to get around some of those different things. So I did my PhD at Brown under Dietrich Rischenmeier in comparative historical sociology, so I was well versed in all of these big picture stories of world systems theory and all the rest of it. But when I came to actually doing my PhD research, I just said, well, it's all very nice. I can read these big meta stories about how the world came to be the way it was. But I actually did what others might then think is a much smaller intervention. I was looking at the beginnings of microcredit programs, how they've evolved in the 19th century, and then how they've been replicated in the early parts of the 20th and through to the late parts of the 20th century in different ways in different countries for different reasons. And I was able to apply some social theory to explaining why those particular programs had succeeded or not, and that theory turned out to be pretty useful for a whole bunch of other people trying to make sense of development. So I ended up sort of doing what we might call sort of a Mertonian sort of middle range theory approach to thinking about these things. It wasn't sort of high grand political economy work, and it wasn't really trying to do anthropology or ethnography at the micro level. But really trying to look at how transitions between different organizational stages had occurred that enabled scale to be reached, so that it wasn't just getting 100 people from this side of a poverty line to another, but it was getting tens of thousands, millions of people into a whole different place, engaging with the financial systems that had otherwise left them prone to usurious money lenders and other predators who were a major blockage to many poor people getting ahead. And by extension, I think those are the kinds of ways in which I've started to I came to think about a lot of these things. When I joined faculty part-time at the Kennedy School, teaching around a lot of these things, we very much stressed to our students and to executive ed summaries as well that the big thing wasn't just about coming up with a technical solution, as important as that is, and as much as that makes us feel good and vindicates our PhDs and all those other nice things we might associate with coming up with our solution. The second and third steps for all of that were getting political support. Who was actually going to support this? Some people are going to hate it, and just as a matter of principle, because your particular party was supporting it. How are we going to do or forge a sufficient deal that's going to enable your particular strategy to get the adequate political and financial support to become real? And having done that, does the designated administrative entity whose job it is to implement what you're talking about actually have the capability to do this, right? And read Akhil Gupta's red tape, brilliant anthropological account of much of the early work in NREGA, about how on the first half of the book, it's all a big story of congratulation, of high-fiving as all the smart people figure out how to write the policy in the right way. I mentioned to twist enough arms to get it being supported. Great. The policy has been achieved, yay. And the second half of the book is a weeping and gnashing of teeth of what happened when the administrative systems charged with doing all of that stuff and with targeting this to certain groups and not others just completely blew up, right? And that, to me, was a really good example of much of what we do in the world, at least in the academic spaces. We think a lot about that first half, about how we can design it the right way, how we can cost it out, because we've got tools and techniques that enable us to do all of that stuff. But the much messier work of getting the political support and financial support for it, and then the even messier work of rolling this thing out for millions of people across the whole country. Organizational sociology should be able to say something really sensible about what's likely to happen when you're trying to do that. And much of what I subsequently did with two of my other colleagues at the Kennedy School was to try and articulate what an applied version of organizational sociology might look like when it comes to trying to enhance the capability of these systems to do the really difficult implementation work associated with this thing we call, otherwise just called a policy. So really trying to think about these as when in the response space, the solution space alone, but the response space is having something that's technically sound, politically supportable, and administratively implementable. That triangle is the prism through which we teach a lot of our students, all our students, how to think about these things. And I think for those of us trying to turn our sociological training into something that can then actually make a difference in the world, we've got to get beyond just I'm the solution provider for you, to get well beyond that into the space of the gritty work of getting the political support and the harder work of actually implementing a lot of that kind of stuff. Now, to do that kind of work, I would suggest if you're wanting to really get a stronger feel for the challenges associated with doing that, sign up to do an evaluation, if you ever are able to, of a policy intervention of one kind or another, right? That's where you will really see how good your theory and how good your methods are. Because if it's done the right way, you would recognize an undergraduate principle and methodology that the problem should drive the methods and not the other way around. And once you get into too elite a field of research, the temptation to flip that is so strong. I've invested my life in getting my technical skills down such a particular level. I just then sell myself to the rest of the world around problems that happen to fit the particular toolkit that I happen to get paid a lot of money to do because I'm one of the rare people in the world that can do it. Right? Do an evaluation of a middle of the road project somewhere in the world, and then feel what pressure is really like. Right? What political pressure feels like when you're assessing a flagship initiative of a mayor, right, or a flagship initiative of a president of a country. You have to live that kind of pressure to be able to then say, I can stand up and I can hold my ground in the face of all of that. And that's the real world. But it's also just how you learn and how I've learned the very hard way how to be able to articulate and defend an analytic and scholarly space in the face of very, very powerful pressure to be able to produce answers that the system wants to hear. Right? So that's my sort of one of the big recommendations. We wanted to really get a sense of what policy work looks like in development. Put all your theory and methods to practice in assessing a pretty high stakes evaluation and see how you go. You'll learn all sorts of things you didn't think to learn in grad school by doing an evaluation like that. But we move on into just doubling down on, as I said earlier, about theory and methods. That's what defines a discipline. Where sociology isn't sociology unless it has a distinctive set of theories and a distinctive set of methods. That's true across the entire university. So if we're going to be useful in the world, we've got to be able to show that the kinds of theory that we articulate and then the kind of methods we invoke, and sociology, to its great credit, is, as we've heard already, and we all know, is a multi-disciplined, multi-method space, which on a good day accommodates all these very different ways of thinking about things. But the theory aspect isn't just whether I know my Marx and my Gramsci and my Weber and my Durkheim, but it's thinking about the theory of change that's been invoked in any given moment. Everyone's a theorist when it comes to arguing for why their particular intervention is the best thing ever and why people what should be supporting it. Much of the work we do in scholarship when we're trying to make a difference in the world follows a theory of change that says if I write the most brilliant paper ever and get it published in an elite journal, this group called policymakers is going to read it. They're going to have an epiphany and they're going to do things really differently than the way we do. That's the theory of change that underpins much of our work. How strong is that particular theory? Pretty weak, I would suggest. Right? We can console ourselves by that particular theory of change because it makes us feel good. It means that we're making a difference. We have policy implications in the past page and a half of our paper, and they're supposed to read that and sort of do more of this and do a bit less of that. Okay? I would suggest a sociological theory of change would have a much richer understanding, if we took it seriously, about what it would take to actually turn what you're doing into something that someone somewhere in Fiji, in Peru, in Pakistan, in a tiny village somewhere or in the capital city can actually work with and understand and insert into their existing policy-making space. And to do that kind of work, you've got to be in it. You've got to be able to deal with all the crazy set of forces and vectors of influence surrounding you that you can't know as an outsider, but which you have to navigate and figure out nonetheless. Your intuition, your capacity to think under a lot of intense pressure in the face of deep uncertainty has to be how you function. And where does that come for us? It comes from our social theory and social methods. That's the only tool we've got to work on with when we're dealing, in my case, just in the last year alone, with helping to co-write the World Bank's gender strategy, articulating a big evaluation of the World Bank's worst 20 environmental projects, engaging with wholesale transformation of the Canadian government. Right? What did I learn about that in grad school? Zippo, right? But I learned good social theory, I learned good social methods. I survived 26 years by somehow figuring out how to apply that. And I think not everybody should do that. I'm not suggesting they should. I just knew from the beginning that I was not going to learn what I needed to learn about this crazy field we call development by just being in a university campus all the time. I get my little shot on a Friday afternoon in the spring semester and I get to teach my class about development the way it should be understood. But the rest of the time, I'm in this pressure cooker of trying to figure out how to be the lone waver of a sociology flag, trying to engage with these otherwise very normal and big questions of development, but being able to provide sound, supportable, implementable responses to all those different things. One final point before I finish. One of the common challenges that we face, everybody faces in development, but I think where there's a huge role for well-trained methodologists to contribute is not so much in the internal validity space, in the identification space, where we're all in grad school on identification. We're all about trying to show that my causal model controls for all the things we need to control for, that more of this is going to drive or get less of that, whatever. Where we're in kindergarten, it seems to me, is in other different dimensions of external validity, of going from a big picture story about what a global database might tell us about the state of the world, about whether exiting from free trade agreements, for example, raises your rule of law index score, right? That's true across a big metadata set of 130 countries. If I put you on a plane to Fiji, are you actually going to advise the Minister of Finance that he should exit from his regional trade agreements because he needs to seek a 1.8 improvement in his rule of law score? Right? No, I hope. Because you need to hold out a whole bunch of other things other than just what happens to be a fancy publication in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Right? So that ecological inference problem of going from a big problem, big truth that exists up here, to the advice I provide to Pakistan or to a state within India or to a tiny village in the middle of Malawi, right? How do we do that work of transitioning from what appears to be empirically true here, and how do we turn that into something actionable at a much more micro scale here? The opposite's true as well. If I have a pilot intervention, under what conditions can I be confident that if I make this now a flagship national or citywide program, that the result I got as a pilot is going to generate the same kind of impacts when I make it 100 times bigger, right? We face that kind of challenge all the time. Or the replication challenge. Worked great in Pakistan, is it going to work in Peru, right? So much of dumb decision-making takes place in development because we believe that rigorous evidence alone provides the warrant for being able to cut and paste and transfer things all over the world. And that's where so much of our implementation falls apart. It's where so much of what's going on in development doesn't achieve what it wants to achieve because it's violating some pretty basic sociological principles about the array of different supporting factors that make this intervention work. When all you've done is control the ones inside the house, then you make this classic, should be kindergarten level errors of being able to make these inferences about where things will work elsewhere. So this is a field where those kind of issues just drive me nuts because I see it happening so frequently. And under pressure, people working in fragile states or working in unstable circumstances, your defense when you're under pressure is to appeal to the fact that someone somewhere has got an article published on it in a serious journal that says this works, capital T, capital W, right? And it doesn't work, it can work. And that's a huge, big analytic distinction that just gets elided over so routinely. Sociologists exist to be the context people, not in just the context of something that's out there that we have to understand and apprehend in a more sophisticated way, but recognize that we are a context. We as researchers, we as academically trained people are a context. We, the organization we work for, are a context that has a whole life world in a classic Habermasian sense built around who we are, what counts as a question and what counts as an answer inside our little heads may or may not be one that resonates with what counts as a question and what counts as an answer somewhere else. Sociology should teach you that reflexively for how you go about doing things. And so much then of the craziness that goes on in development, if it took its sociology seriously, I think, well, I'm vain enough on behalf of all of you to suggest would actually make a difference. So that's what I conclude by saying, don't apologize for being a sociologist, be a good one. Don't try and be a bad economist, be a better one in the sense that you recognize and appreciate the fullness of the theory and method that's required to actually inform, design, assess, replicate, scale, disseminate so much of the things that we've been talking about here over these last few days. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, everyone. And those talks kind of resonate with each other in interesting ways and kind of conflict with each other in interesting ways as well, which I hope will pull out a little bit. Yeah, so let's go ahead and open it up for questions. I have about 15 minutes for questions.
What he said, we need to evaluate projects. When government have projects, they also evaluate, but it is not very reliable because it's also done by state apparatus. And sometimes it becomes a propaganda. So what would be the role of sociologists who would be maybe outsiders who could then evaluate projects of governments and including projects of non-governmental organizations? Do you think that's a viable project
evaluating the evaluators. Does anybody want to speak to that?
I think from my experience at least, it has to be a two-step process in the sense that you probably won't be, or your team even won't be the ones that that provide the verdict of your evaluation to the most senior people. And you do the work, but the actual messenger who has the meeting with the mayor or the prime minister won't be you. It'll be somebody else. And I think your big first step in agreeing to do something like that is understanding who's that messenger going to be. My best days at the World Bank, when a vice president looks at a team in the eye and said, you do your job, you find what you find, you apply the best theory, best methods, the most comprehensive analysis you can within the time we've got, the budget you've got, the people you've got, you get that answer. It's my job to deal with the heat of this politically, to deal with the media fallout that might happen as a result of that. If you get someone who's got enough layers of skin on their body to do that kind of work, then this is then you're in a really fun place to work. Then it feels really real. If that person is going to be folding and is going to say whatever they're going to say, irrespective of what you're saying, don't even bother doing the evaluation because this is not going to work. I've been very fortunate to be able to work with people who I know are those people. If the verdict's not going to go so well, they're paid a lot of money to be able to deal with that. I'm paid what I'm paid to do good evaluation work. But experiencing that dynamic and then having the very, I think, very comforting and very rewarding feeling, working as part of a team where you know that the messenger is going to take a bullet if that's what it takes. That's when social science is fun.
Jed Schwartz from Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm giving I'm in a panel tomorrow at 9:30 from 9:44, talking about shifting foreign aid from the loan paradigm, which seems to fail too often because of lack of demand capabilities in the poorer nations of the world that are most needy, to a different paradigm involving attempts to strengthen the indigenous currencies of those countries by arguing for national and investments designed to strengthen those currencies by investing in their treasury offering. Almost all countries in the world have treasury offerings. The reason their currencies are so weak is because almost no one wants to buy them. So anyway, I'm developing this idea in a paper tomorrow, and anyone who's interested is, hopefully something.
Why don't we collect a few more questions here?
This is most directly responding to Michael, but I'm wondering to the panel at large. When Michael invoked project evaluation, it made me think that there are kind of at least two broad categories of project evaluation. There's a very, I think Michael's more referring to the contemporary mode of project evaluation and the kinds of dilemmas that he's describing come out of that mode. But there's an earlier mode that I think of through Albert Hirschman's Development Projects Observed, which is a book that I think is out of print, but you can get the PDF easily online. In that book, he's not kind of giving quantitative assessments of how projects work, but he derives very simple principles from the projects that he looks at that he is suggesting could be quite usable to practitioners. And the kinds of principles that he derives, and the most famous one is, at least in my mind, is the principle of the hiding hand. This gets me back to something that Rina was talking about in this morning's panel, which was when she referred to how sociological methodologies help us observe or analyze the legitimacy of various interventions at a wide range of scales. And in essence, the kinds of qualitative assessments that Hirschman was doing in his type of project evaluation was about this sociological legitimacy of intervention. I'm wondering how you think about that kind of legitimacy and intervention in the kinds of problem solving or gesturing at problem solving that each of you are doing in this panel.
Thank you. My question is for Patrick. You talked about the kind of like the resiliency of some institutions to this kind of like anti-democratic backlash, namely the case of Brazil, but I think it's also true in Australia, to some extent, France, etc. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit of what you think explains why some institutions are resilient and some are not, and maybe what lessons we can learn when thinking about designing institutions or implementing projects to make it so that they can survive the kind of like ebbs and flow of like populism, anti-democratic movements, right-wing backlash, etc.
Would you like to respond?
On resilience. Yeah, I think there's a lot of variance across the cases. So, I mean, in Brazil, it's really clear that the institutions held during Bolsonaro. I mean, the court already had quite a significant degree of autonomy and held him to account, and now he can't present himself for 8 years, right? So he did what Trump did and got punished for it. We're still working on that, right? So that's, for me, clearly a case of institutional resiliency. That said, throughout the period where Bolsonaro was in power, organized civil society was quite vociferous in Brazil, and I think lent a lot of political weight to the institutions, right? So I think it emboldened the courts and other institutions to hold Bolsonaro to account. In India, in contrast, the institutions have nearly collapsed. I mean, the media, the independent media in India is gone for all intents and purposes. The judiciary has been politicized, the universities, the think tanks, they're all under direct surveillance now by the BJP and the RSS. And it's really subaltern civil society. We know that, Modi thought he was going to get 400 seats. And he wanted 400 seats because he wanted to be able to rewrite the Constitution. And he got a lot less than anticipated and had to go into coalition. And I have colleagues, Yamini Iyer and others who did some field work at the time of the elections. And to them, it became very, very clear that Dalits in particular, who had been voting for the BJP, were so concerned about these attacks on the Constitution that they abandoned the BJP, right? So in that instance, it's clearly a civil society story, right? And then, Europe is a bit more complicated, et cetera. But I don't think we have a general theory of democratic resiliency. Sometimes it's the institution, sometimes it's civil society. But the one thing about ethno-populists is that they overpromise. This is their one extraordinary weakness, right? And at some point, there's an accounting. And in India, they've had an accounting. Certainly there was one for Bolsonaro.
Yeah, three cheers for reviving the spirit of the person, of the person. Development Projects Observed is one of those short, super classic books that everybody in development should be able to quote chapter and verse from. The second favorite set of conferences I go to are the American Evaluation Association, because if you only look at it from a narrow academic point of view, you'd think it was just a whole parade of people doing RCTs. That's what evaluation is. And it's this a wonderland of people doing everything from earned income tax credits through to No Child Left Behind, all these monstrously big ones, down to more targeted, more focused kinds of ones. So there's a whole array of different types of things that are in this place called the evaluation tent. I'm suggesting that there's many different ways you can do those evaluations. Just get a sense of what it's like to try and talk to other people or tell the people who are either the recipients or the deliverers of these interventions or the funders of them more specifically.
things about those projects that they don't already know, or that are important either from in a pragmatic sense of trying to improve the project, trying to replicate it potentially somewhere else, or just actually trying to make a quite fiduciary kind of claim about the actual impacts that are being achieved as a result of this. Most of the interventions I think sociologists find interesting are the ones that aren't just these a bit beyond much of even the conditional cash transfer kind of work, where in a mechanical sense, the causal impact is all around a finite, well-known, equal for everyone sort of amount of money. The kinds of projects that I was introduced to at the World Bank when I first went there were this whole portfolio of work just starting at that time that has become very big over the last decades, called community-driven development, CDD. And CDD has people as the means of delivering and people and groups as the ends of development. So you've got all sorts of wild heterogeneity going on there. Some people have tried to do RCTs around all of that, but the most interesting ones are just inherently finding, unsurprisingly, that they work spectacularly well for some people. They are indifferent to another group of people and diabolically awful for other people. By the time that filters up to the 13th floor of the World Bank, it has to be either a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And they're trying to help people to think about the fact that certain kinds of interventions have this inherent variability in the same way that marriage counseling and diplomacy and social work inherently is going to produce big and variable outcomes. It doesn't work in some neat clinical or mechanical kind of way. Trying to help people not just think about whether it works in aggregate, but if you're getting these wide standard deviations at subnational levels or subnational levels, all of that should be able to be reported accurately, but then also helps to inform a more sophisticated dialogue rather than these crucial things where everybody feels under pressure to provide a guaranteed, surefire, yes, if I do this, I'm going to get that kind of outcome. All the really serious problems in the world don't have those kinds of solutions. They never have. They will never have them. But we've got to try them nonetheless. And feeling that, being in a room where that kind of conversations happens, has to happen, but everybody wants it to be much simpler than that. That's what you've got to experience as well, I think. So not just the telling bad news to powerful people kind of story, but a more sophisticated learning story about how you integrate all these, or reconcile these very different kinds of impacts that are likely to occur when you are doing projects that are grounded ultimately in some form of social theory.
Does the rest of the panel want to comment? So maybe just to respond to, or try to respond to the maybe how we can find social legitimacy, right? So some of these policy changes. So I just wanted to here suggest maybe the need to pay attention to the pulse of the streets, right? So in these contexts, so what's happening, and I think it's so yes, we have the work of policymakers, but also how the buying within, right, within these communities. So one example, again, going back to that moment of protest in 2011, so part of the ways to understand those revolutions was that, you know, it was, you had the involvement of the middle class, right, wanting freedom, and the lower income class wanting bread, right? So it was called the revolutions of bread and freedom, right? So you had the two coming together. And for instance, I'm just going to give an example of Morocco, which has before this particular policy project of the Human Development Initiative, HDI, and the HDI was tackling issues of poverty, but poverty here tackled to combat terrorism, right? So this was also the greater context of the global war on terrorism, right? So in that sense, I think there wasn't maybe as much social legitimacy. There was this dissonance, right, in the policy project of actually, instead of really being about the genuine interests of the community, right, in sort of
dealing with these problems of poverty. It was more to actually tackle a foreign interest, right, of limiting migration, right? That presents, right, this sort of threat of heightened terrorism, right? So yeah, just.
And we're just at time, so I will just mention one last thing. Tomorrow, we continue this conversation in two practitioner plenaries that we have. In the first one, practitioners from the USAID and the World Bank are going to discuss how practitioners use academic research. And in the second one, they're especially focusing on the use of qualitative research for development. And so we have wine and beer and plenty of goodies for you in the back room, and the terrace will also be open during the reception. Thanks very much. And please give a.